Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm surprised at how many people are here, given that the Brewers are playing the Dodgers tonight. There's Monday Night Football. I am a Packer owner, me and 271,000 other people. So I feel like I need to share a Packer story with you. You just heard that I moved from UW-Madison to Northwestern for the last 7 years of my academic career. And so there are these two little boys who were throwing a football around in Grant Park, Chicago, and this dog jumps out of the bushes and starts attacking one of the boys. And his quick-thinking friend grabs a stick and smacks the dog over the head, saves his friend. And there was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune who happened to be walking by, saw the whole thing, and was really inspired to write a story. But he was a sports reporter, so everything was filtered through sports. So he runs up to the kid and says, Kid, I saw what you did. You're a hero, kid. How does this sound? Young Chicago Bear fan saves friend from vicious dog attack. And the kid says, well, that's nice, mister, but I'm not a Chicago Bear fan. And the reporter said, you're in Grant Park, Chicago. Okay, all right. So he scribbles some more and he goes, how's this? Young Minnesota Viking fan, braves all, saves friend from bad dog. And the kid says, well, that's nice too, mister, but I'm not a Minnesota Viking fan. And the reporter says, kid, I'm under deadline. Just tell me, what team do you root for? And the kid says, I'm a Green Bay Packer fan. And the reporter, who is kind of a homer, brows furrow and he starts scribbling on his pad and says, okay, how's this? Young cheesehead bastard murders beloved family pet. Yeah, once a Packer fan, always a Packer fan. If there's time, maybe I'll tell you another one. This one featuring the Minnesota Vikings. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I want to introduce myself. And I've been trying to study the Ojibwe language, and Richard, if I screw this up, forgive me, but Buju Niji, Padilo, Waswakanokwe, Indigenous, Mashkazibi, and Dojaba. I've just told you that I've introduced myself as Torchlight on the Water Woman, also known, my taxpayer name is Patty Lowe. I didn't say taxpayer because I don't know how to say that in Ojibwe. And I told you that I'm from Mashkazibi, which is the Bad River Band of Lake Superior tribe of Chippewa Indians. We call ourselves Ojibwe, but Mashkazibi is the word that we use for ourselves, which translates to Medicine River. Nothing bad about the Bad River. It's a beautiful river that has been supplying us for years. Tonight I want to talk about some research that I'm doing, and I'm a little trepidatious about it because it involves some of our old stories, and it's never, sometimes it's not good to mess with old stories. But I think it's really compelling, and I'm trying to figure out how to tell it in a respectful way. Iceland to Madeline. Madeline refers to Madeline Island, which was kind of the epicenter for the Ojibwe world. And underneath you see dangerous connections between Vikings and the Ojibwe. Dangerous, not because there's clear evidence of direct contact between Norse colonists and the Ojibwe, although it's possible, but because the connections raise cultural and really ethical questions for researchers like me. I want to talk about 4 main research threads: the Anishinaabe migration story, Icelandic sagas, and you're probably going, where did that come from? Well, I went to school in Copenhagen as an undergraduate 50 years ago, this year actually, 50 years ago. And I got interested in all things Norse, and I started reading these Icelandic sagas, and there are all these references to native people in them. And I remembered that because I took a trip back to Iceland and Denmark last year, and it just it's been percolating for about 10 years now. I'm also interested in European explorer accounts and non-indigenous astronomy. So there's some really interesting threads that are coming together in this. But my primary concern is how to use Western sources in a way that honors indigenous traditions without suggesting that our Ojibwe migration stories need to be validated by Western history or Western astronomy or Western literary sources like the sagas. And that's where it's kind of touchy for me. So, the Ojibwe migration. Our migration story, there's a couple of different variations to it. Some stories begin with us being in the East and coming back, but some of the older stories, and a lot of the stories from elders in Canada, have us in the Great Lakes. Something happens, the land becomes uninhabitable, we move east, and then there's a crisis, and we move back. One of the things that is also part of these prophecies is that there's this Migas shell that appears in the sky, and Migas is a saltwater cowrie shell that you find on the east coast of the Atlantic seaboard, really. And so this shell appears in the sky, we follow it, and we return to our original homes where the food grows on water. So this is the path that the Ojibwe took. You see us in the Gulf of St. Lawrence there, and we know it was a long, long time ago. And I'm going to get into time and why time is kind of a problem when you talk about Native history. But you see that we follow this path through 7 stopping places down what today is the St. Lawrence River, through the Great Lakes, and then once we get to the western edge of Lake Erie, this tribe of Anishinaabe splits, and some go north and some go south. The Anishinaabe, when I talk about the Anishinaabe, we're talking about the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Odawa, who all travel together. And then at some point we develop our individual identities. But together we still consider ourselves Anishinaabe. It was a confederacy, still is. So that's the Ojibwe migration. And the next slide here is an interview with a wonderful, wise man, my mentor, Joe Rose, who was it's hard to describe Joe Rose, huh, Rich? He was a professor, he had multiple degrees, he was the director of Native Studies for Northland College, he was a highly placed Medewan, it's our traditional religion, he was highly placed in that. I've never known anybody who had more skills, life skills. He could build a shelter that would protect him in 30 below weather. He could build solar. I've seen him build solar ovens. He was a flint knapper. He just knew how to do everything. And I always thought, if I knew the world was in trouble and 90% of the population was going to, disappear and only 10% were going to survive, I was going to head to Joe Rose because I knew that he would be able to survive. Sadly, we lost him during COVID, but he's going to explain the Ojibwe migration story.
People are going on while I talked about the 7 stopping off places. And then, according to some of the stories that I've heard, was that the original homeland was right there in the western Great Lakes area. And then our And that, Sault Ste. Marie, there were two groups. One group split and went north of Lake Superior. The other group split and went south of Lake Superior, and they went over on the St. Louis River by the Lake Superior. And they sent their scouts out and they found the food that was growing on the water. That was one of the signs that they were supposed to look for. And so they sent their scouts out and they found the food that was growing on the water. But they were also told that they wouldn't be home again until the rain appeared for the first time. So they went up to the high ground over there and they fasted and meditated. And the message came to them that they were to double back to what they called 120. The day that high ground over there was called that Spirit Mountain. And they have a good speed over there nowadays. But anyway, they came back to Madeline Island. Morning, good morning. Madeline Island. It means the home of the golden-breasted woodpecker, or the flicker. And so the Lakers appeared off of the shores of Madeline Island for the seventh time. And they knew that they were home. They sent their scouts across from, well, they were pretty familiar with the territory already, but they sent their scouts across from Sandcut Slough over to the Taconic Sloughs, and they found the wildlife growing more profusely than they had ever seen it anywhere in the Taconic Sloughs. And so the wildlife was declared sacred from that time on. So every time we have a feast or a ceremony, we always include wild rice on the menu because it plays such an important role in our migration story. And it was one of the signs that was given to the people on the migration journey.
So that's Joe Rose telling the Ojibwe migration story. So when we talk about history, there's a real difference between the way traditional Native people think about history and the way mainstream folks think about history. I was trained as a historian, and I have a colonized mind, and history is linear, right? You pick a date, you end with a date, you think, or you pick an event, and you plug in all the names and dates and facts and presidents and wars along that timeline, right? And that's history. So the when is really important, and then you provide evidence along that timeline. That's not the way people think in Native communities. In Native communities, it's all about place. It's a special place that people have. And everything worth remembering kind of radiates out of that place. Law, politics, ritual, education, ceremony. So the why, the give us meaning part of history is place-based. It's not time-based. And so it's not important to us. And I'm thinking about Richard Carol Cornelius. I was doing some research on the formation of what we used to call the Iroquois Confederacy, which is it's really not a very polite word. They call themselves Haudenosaunee. It means people building a longhouse. And there was some research about when the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was founded. And the oral history is that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was founded a long time ago during the month of the ripening corn when a sun went dark from the sky. So a solar eclipse, right? And so this team of researchers combined oral history and then got an ethno-astronomer to kind of plot out all the solar eclipses that would have been visible in present-day upstate New York, where the Oneida were living, during the month of August, which is the month of ripening corn. And there was only one eclipse that met the standards, because they knew it was sometime between 600 AD and 1100 AD, or 1500 AD. And so in plotting out all the eclipses, it was clear that there was only one, and it was at 3:10 in the afternoon on August 25th in the year 1142. So I'm reading this and I'm all excited, me and my little colonized mind, and I go get in my car and I drive up to Oneida and I see Dr. Carol Cornelius, who's an expert on corn, and I show her the research and, isn't this exciting? What do you think? And she said, it's not important to us. We're comfortable with just our Confederacy was founded a long time ago. We don't need a date, And so it was, and here I am, I'm writing a history book at the time, and all of a sudden I'm starting to get this, my head is twisting around like, well, who is that girl in Rosemary's Baby? and I'm so I'm trying to get my colonized mind in under control and trying to be more place-based, and so I'm and I'm involving Native people in each of the 12 communities who are reading what I've written in their chapters and commenting and correcting me and suggesting other things. So in one case I had written that the Mohicans moved their villages every 10 years or so when they're, or 20 years or so when their garden soils were exhausted. And I sent it off, and Dot David, lovely woman who is chairing the reading committee of my chapter, sends it back to me, and in the margin writes, "That sounds so white. Why don't you just say we moved our gardens as often as we needed to?" And so, delete, moved their gardens as often as was necessary. And I sent it off to my editor at the Wisconsin Wisconsin Historical Society Press, who sends it back to me with a notation in exactly the same place saying, "Could you be more precise on the date?" So there was a lot of tension in writing my books. But this is the thing about history: time-based or place-based. So, having just told you that time is a problem, when did the Ojibwe arrive on Madeline? Well, Western historians tell us that it was the 1700s, because in their interpretation of history, the Ojibwe were just one of those tribes in the east who got between the Haudenosaunee and other folks during the Beaver Wars, and everybody was displaced and moved west, and we were just one of those refugee tribes, which the Ojibwe, really bristle at. Eddie Benton, who was a very highly placed Midewan member and an educator, thinks that the migration happened about 900 before present and took maybe 500 years to complete. William Warren, who is kind of this mixed blood would-be historian, theorized that the Ojibwe arrived on Madeline Island 10 years before Columbus landed in the New World. And what he cites this medal, this medallion from a chief that has these etchings in it and figures. And it's a mnemonic device, and he's looking at the generations that are etched into this medallion, and that's why he came up with 10 years before Columbus arrived. Okay, that's what's going on in our community. Meanwhile, the Vikings. So I'm looking at the sagas, and there's two sagas in particular. There's the Eric the Red saga and the Greenlander saga. Eric the Red was the son of Thorvald, who was banished from Norway and resettled in Iceland. Eric was banished from Iceland, and in the year 982 before present, sets off to explore modern-day Greenland, Newfoundland, Labrador, and perhaps points farther south. The Greenlander saga is similar to the Eric the Red saga, but it's got additional descriptions of interactions with native people. This was mind-blowing. Yeah. I mean, look at where I don't know if you can see the detail, but in the year 700, the Vikings are sailing down the Volga River. They're sailing through the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea. They're checking out Beirut. I was in Istanbul 3 days ago at a museum, and there are Icelandic ruins, Viking ruins, in a museum in Istanbul. They were everywhere. And then they start exploring to the west, Newfoundland, Labrador. But the boatmanship of these folks was absolutely astonishing. I had no idea what incredible seafarers they were. So, in the west, they're exploring points west of Iceland, and there are these archaeological points in Newfoundland, one of them being Lonso Meadows, which has been reconstructed, and it was a fairly sizable Viking colony, Norse colony, and there are characteristics, and they've found other archaeological settlements, 3 in particular in Newfoundland, mostly in Newfoundland. But now there's some other places that are turning up more recently. But the characteristics of Lonso Meadows: longhouses, sod roofs, metallurgy, because if you're going to sail the ocean's blue, you need nails, and you need, and this is one of the interesting things that I learned about Viking boat making. The reason why they were able to sail the distances they figured out a way to galvanize their nails. And so in addition to these settlements, there are also these, archaeologists are finding these boat repair places all along the eastern seaboard, as far south perhaps as Cape Cod and Providence, Rhode Island, present-day Providence, Rhode Island. The other thing, slag. So if you are, using fire and melting ore, it's going to create residue. So this is another thing that archaeologists look for when they're looking at Viking settlements. Nails, of course, soil structure, and butternuts. This was really an interesting find at Lonso Meadows, butternuts, because butternuts don't grow anywhere in Newfoundland. They don't grow in Labrador. They don't grow in Nova Scotia. They don't grow in Prince Edward Island. The closest that butternuts grow is in the Gulf of St. Lawrence area, which I think is pretty interesting. So the way they date this stuff is with radiocarbon dating and soil analysis. So here's a couple of interesting little excerpts from the sagas. The boat they dragged behind the ship was filled with grapes. Oh, that's another thing. Grapes don't grow on Newfoundland, anywhere in Newfoundland either. A cargo sufficient for the ship was cut, and when the spring came, they made their ship ready and sailed away. And from its products, Leif Erikson, or Leif Erikson, is the son of Eric the Red, gave the land a name and called it Vinland. So he's calling Newfoundland Vinland, even though no grapes grow there, and maybe it was just kind of a good sales job to get people to come, no, you're not coming to a land of snow and ice and desolation. No, there are grapes there. Yeah, there are grapes, and there's green, and it's viney, and we're going to call it Vinland. The problem was that grapes and butternuts, butternut trees in the 10th century didn't grow anywhere in Newfoundland, Labrador, Nova Scotia, Prince. So was Leif maybe using his father's trick of bestowing an attractive name, because he's calling it Greenland, right? And Greenland, as we know, is not green. Maybe he's just trying to sign up colonists. Or was Vinland really somewhere south? That's the other kind of interesting question in all of this. So where was Vinland? Well, Vinland was most likely, according to all the more recent archaeology, in present-day Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, which is, as you can see, right in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where who was living at the time? Our folks, the Ojibwe, were there in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, if you believe some of the Ojibwe scholars. So the Vikings and the Ojibwe are in the same place, perhaps at the same time. And this is what we get from our oral history and from some of our elders. Someplace on the shore. Where were we in the 10th century? Well, or 11th century. Somewhere on the shores of the Great Salt Water in the east. That's what Eddie Benton Benet tells us. Probably at the mouth of the St. Lawrence. That was Edmund Danziger citing Chippewa tradition. The Ojibwe lived near the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. Dr. Lorraine Roy, a White Earth Ojibwe professor at the University of Texas. The mouth of the St. Lawrence River, that we heard that from Joe Rose. So, both the Ojibwe and the Vikings are in the present-day Gulf of St. Lawrence area in the 10th and 11th centuries. And remember Joe was talking about the crisis? All right. So in the two sagas, there are multiple references to Skraelings. This is what the Vikings called the indigenous people they met in the New World. Both the Eric the Red and Greenlander sagas describe encounters between the Vikings and the indigenous people, the Norse called the Skraelings. Most of the encounters are violent. In one clash, a one-footed native fatally shoots Eric's son Thorvald. The Vikings murder 5 natives sleeping under skin canoes. That's another reference. In another encounter, they kill a family and kidnap 2 children, which they take back to Norway and baptize. And what's really interesting is in Iceland, I just read a story about a family in Iceland that has a whole bunch of native DNA in their genome. Is that the right term? Anyway, they did one of those 21andMe or 23andMe tests, and there's all this native DNA and they're trying to figure out where it came from. Maybe it came from these 2 kids that were kidnapped way back when. But in addition to all these violent encounters, there's also trade. And in some of the references, the Skraelings trade pelts, and they want weapons. The Vikings want pelts and wood for their boats, but they won't trade for weapons. Instead, they trade red cloth and milk. Milk, that's going to be a problem. Anybody guess why? Even today, Native people, a surprising number of, maybe not so surprising number of Native people are lactose intolerant. These are people that didn't have domestic animals, so they're not drinking milk from cows and sheep and goats. And you can imagine that they probably got really, really, really sick. Not surprisingly, days later, the Skraelings mass and attack from all directions. And here's what we get from the Eric the Red saga. They encountered one another and fought, and there was a great shower of missiles. The Skrælingers also had war slings and catapults. They were now of the opinion that though the land might be choice and good, there would always be war and terror overhanging them from those who dwelt there before them. They made ready, therefore, to move away with the intent to go back to their own land. Okay, so remember the red cloth? 500 years later, French explorers describe meeting Algonquin-speaking people, those are our people, wearing bits of red cloth as hair adornments. And I can imagine that, the locals were really interested in this, whatever passed for commercially red dyed cloth in the Middle Ages. That was something that was just really precious. And over time, they probably cut it into little pieces and passed it down or traded it. And, so in the 1500s, they're wearing it in their hair. And I think it was Champlain was going, no, where did that, I thought I was the first one here, so where'd that come from? Could it have been the same red cloth that was traded 500 years earlier? Possibly. So I had so many questions. Did the Ojibwe interact directly with the Vikings? Did these Viking Skraeling encounters introduce European diseases into the Ojibwe world? Or did they introduce diseases into the Indian trade routes? And whatever people interacted with the Vikings, who then traded with other native people, and maybe the diseases were passed down that way. And are these diseases the crises that is told in our prophecies and in our migration stories? Is this the reason why we left the East and came back to our original homes where the food grows on water? So, and a question for me is, how does a native researcher use these sources in a way that's respectful of indigenous knowledge and sacred stories? Okay, and now we get to the point, that this is where I get really, really nervous. The Miigashell. Now we're talking about something sacred, and and I wonder about my own credentials in dabbling in this. Eddie Benton, who shared a lot of stories about our origins, our migrations, our political structures, our social structures, in a book called the Mishomis Book, wrote, "If you do not move, you'll be destroyed. The sacred Migas will lead the way to the chosen ground of the Anishinaabe." That was from the prophet of the first fire. Prophet of the third fire said, "The Anishinaabe will find the path to their chosen ground, a land to the west where they must move their families. This will be the land where food grows on water." So, in 1054, before present, something extraordinary happens. Supernova, the Crab Nebula, exploded, 1054. It was so bright, it lit up the daytime sky for 2 months, and it lit up the nighttime sky for almost 2 years. So I can imagine if the Ojibwe people are are trying to process these new diseases that have been introduced, and they're visioning and they're fasting and they're praying and they're looking for a sign, and holy smokes, there's a supernova. I can imagine where something that dramatic would get integrated into a story that would be passed down about our migration. Is the Crab Nebula the sacred Miga shell? I would never, ever suggest that it is. I don't have the credibility, the authenticity in those kinds of cultural, I don't have the cultural knowledge to say that. I can speculate that it could be somehow conflated, remembered, but there's also theories because according to the stories, the Miga shell appears and disappears for a while, appears and disappears. Could it be Halley's Comet? Could be something, you know, every 81 years? 90 years that the comet is visible? I mean, it could be something like that. Or maybe it's not anything astronomical. But it certainly is interesting. That's a Miga shell, and that's the Crab Nebula. It sure looks like it. And I've looked at that a couple of times going, wow, the Crab Nebula sure looks like the Miga shell. But that's my own interpretation. But it was a dramatic event, you know, daytime sky visible. Oh, I said 2 months, it was actually 3 months, and visible in the nighttime sky for 3 years. So that brings up more questions. Should I even be undertaking this research? You know, I really have a fear that by looking at these sacred stories and also looking at non-indigenous sources, that people reading an account might think that I'm trying to validate our stories with Western astronomy or Icelandic sagas, and that's just not the case. Our stories have integrity and they exist on their own merit. We don't need native or non-native sources to validate our stories. But it also brings up the question, how do I use non-native sources in a culturally responsible way? Am I the right researcher to explore these? I'm not a member of the Meday Society. I don't have that deep knowledge of some of these stories. And you know, there's always the what value does the research bring? And as a journalist, I often tell my students, just because something is interesting, just because, you know, you think it's interesting doesn't mean that it has to be shared. You know, we have stories and traditions in our community that are meant to stay in the community. They're not meant to be shared. And so I have questions about whether I should even be doing this research. But there's so many really intriguing dots that are begging to be connected. The Ojibwe migration story, the Icelandic sagas, the archaeological evidence all indicate that the Ojibwe and the Vikings were in the present-day Gulf of St. Lawrence area in the 10th and 11th centuries. The Ojibwe prophecies reference light-skinned people. The Icelandic sagas describe encounters, both peaceful and violent, between the Vikings and native people. Not necessarily the Ojibwe, but possibly. A crisis develops that sends the Ojibwe west back to their original homes. Is the crisis the introduction of European diseases, either through direct contact or maybe spread to them via the Indian trade routes? The supernova Crab Nebula explodes in the mid-11th century. Does it correspond somehow to prophecies involving the Miga shell? So my approach has been, I was collaborating with Joe Rose, the elder that you saw in the video. We started talking about this about 10 years ago. And, and we had this Icelandic professor, and we were I had applied for a Bellagio fellowship, which is a very cool fellowship that only involves cross-cultural research. And if you get one of these fellowships, you spend a month in a mansion in Tuscany, and all you have to do is show up for dinner and talk. It seemed like a really good deal. So I applied. It looked like I was going to get it, and then Joe said, "You know, I don't fly." So I was like, "Oh, okay." Joe doesn't fly. But we were really, you know, it was such a loss to lose him to COVID, and I couldn't even pick up this research for a couple of years because it just seemed like there was such a big hole missing. But now I'm back in it. I'm talking to elders. I'm talking to other Native scholars about this. I'm talking to Midwaywan members. I'm collaborating with this professor in Iceland. I'm trying to identify an Ojibwe ethno-astronomer. That's kind of the piece that I'm missing right now. And I'm just not going to publish anything until I can confidently answer some of the questions that I have. And with that, I will say miigwech and ask if you have any questions.